All right, what's up, y'all, and welcome back to Teaching Tuesday. Today, we are going to close out our series of the top 5 or 6 or 7 guitar players, depending on the video. And this week, as promised, we are doing contemporary players. So that's players who are around now, who got their start in the 90s to the early aughts, somewhere in that area. But before we do that, some of you may have noticed that I actually only mentioned 4 guitar players last time, so I'm gonna finish out last week's episode with number 5 of that generation, and that is going to be number 5 is going to be Bill Frisell. So Bill is one of my personal favorite guitar players, composers, artists of any genre. And Bill is kind of an interesting character because I like to think of him kind of parallel in a way to Pat Metheny. They are kind of almost the same age, coming up in the same generation, started out in this like the same ECM record label, and also are two of the pioneers, in a sense, of fusing folk and jazz, Americana, pop, folk, and jazz. And that's something that I'm really into. So, I see them as similar in that way, but also very different. So Metheny has like an extremely dark sound and is a total virtuoso in terms of technicality on the instrument. And Frisell has a very bright sound. I mean, he has a lot of different sounds, but his signature is kind of like that bright, twangy Telecaster sound with a lot of echo and reverb, and like almost a kind of Western Americana sound. But he plays very sparsely. You could say he says more with fewer notes. Some might say that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that. But anyways, he's a sparse, more melodic player in my opinion, and he's also kind of an expert at counterpoint. I mean, people don't really give him credit for this, but he's playing there's a lot of attention to detail in terms of like how each note is moving, and obviously that's a little bit easier when you're playing more simply, but he does that in a really like eloquent and beautiful way. So Frisell is also kind of an interesting character because he does have like a few different characters that he plays, a few different styles and sounds that he indulges in, and one of them is a kind of like folksy Americana sound, like I mentioned before, and sometimes that's fused more or less with jazz. And he also kind of goes into like jam band kind of rock blues, jams or segments, and that can also be fused with some more like avant-garde soundscape sort of vibes. And what else? And then he also kind of he plays jazz too, and sometimes it's like freer jazz, or sometimes he's just playing, I don't know, some variation of jazz. So those are just kind of his three kind of like main go-tos. I mean, he also kind of dips a bit into the avant-garde and works that into all 3 of those, I suppose. But those are kind of like his main kind of characters that I think he plays. So, and he also plays in a lot of different kind of groups. But I would say he does the main ones that he's known for are kind of playing in a more jazz-like trio, and then another one where he's playing like more of his compositions, and it's more composed, and sometimes the ensembles are bigger. So I'm going to give an album from each one of those that I really like. So one that's he's very famous for, that it's one of my favorite albums of his, is called East West, and that one is on the None Such label, I think. That was recorded at the Vanguard in 2005, and it's got Kenny Wollesen and Victor Krauss and Tony Scher, depending on the disc. But that's an amazing record. It's a mix of standards and some originals and some kind of folksy traditional songs. All the styles that I kind of just talked about are pretty much embodied in that, starting with a very jammy, I heard it through the grapevine, and then an also jammy but very folksy, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. I love that one, the Bob Dylan tune. And then in terms of his more like him as more of a composer, I'm gonna say a favorite of mine is Good Dog Happy Man, which is from 1999, also on None Such, and it's got Greg Leese, Wayne Horvitz, Victor Krauss, Jim Keltner. It's a beautiful album, and it's got really a lot of that Americana touch that he's known for in a less jazzy way than the album I just mentioned. And then also for him in an even more jazz context, he has a few records where he's just playing like as jazzy as he gets, and one of them is with Paul Motian and Ron Carter, and the other one is with Elvin Jones and Dave Holland. Now they're both great, but I'm gonna recommend the former, and it's just called Bill Frisell, Ron Carter, and Paul Motian from 2006. It's a brilliant album. You can really hear the way that he like weaves through standards in his kind of very sparse, twangy, contrapuntal Americana style, but with two jazz-heavy greats. It's a really a brilliant display. So definitely going to recommend that one. Okay, so now on to contemporary or more contemporary guitar players. We're going to start with one of my personal heroes, and this is definitely someone who's influenced me a great deal in terms of the way I play. I'm sure many of you have noticed, and I've probably seen him more than I've seen any other musician perform. Probably seen him play like 500 times, probably more than that, and that is the great Peter Bernstein. Definitely one of the great jazz guitar players of this era, the 20th, 21st century. So this is kind of going to be the only person in this category that does have more of a straight ahead bent. So Peter, I think, is a really interesting character because he came up at this time of like the resurgence of straight ahead jazz. That's like the 90s, the 70s, the 80s. We're getting into more electronic, less acoustic sounds. And then there was kind of a return back to the acoustic, like original, kind of a return to like the Blue Note era in some ways, but a more swinging acoustic sound. And that was with Wynton and the Young Lions, and then Peter is kind of part of that Young Lions group, or at least very adjacent to that. People like Joshua Redman and Christian McBride and Nicholas Payton, and so he does have that kind of old school jazz, like original jazz guitar aesthetic, very reminiscent of Grant Green, Wes Montgomery. When he was first coming up, people were comparing him a lot to Grant Green, and I think that's fair in a way. He definitely has that aesthetic. He's got a bright, like classic jazz guitar tone, but especially over the last 20 years or so, you can really see him develop his own sound in a way that's so much that's so far from that Grant Green, although you can still hear that in his playing. And you can Peter's playing to me is such a beautiful representation of jazz. It has everything, like the whole history, the spectrum of jazz in his playing. Like, of course, he's got Grant Green, he's got Wes Montgomery, Kenny Burrell, but you can hear, John Coltrane, Coleman Hawkins, McCoy Tyner, Larry Young. I mean, you can really hear so much history in his playing. And he just kind of is somebody to me who just eats, breathes, and sleeps jazz. It's just like in his blood. Okay, and then another thing I wanted to say is that he's somebody who can kind of like walk this delicate line. Like he's somebody that almost people from every walk of jazz almost have respect for him, because he is very deeply rooted in the tradition, American songbook, the history of jazz, the lineage, but he can also hang and hold his own with more modern players. He plays with, he's on records with Joshua Redman. He came up in New York with Brad Meldau. His own group is, he's famous for playing with his peers, Larry Goldings and Bill Stewart, who are, at least relatively pretty contemporary players. So he can really kind of walk that line and still have his own voice too. He's not like playing a different character. So that's definitely something like pretty unique to him. So, but he does still kind of have that classic jazz guitar aesthetic. He plays a full hollow body and he plugs right into the amp, no pedals. So, I think he's probably the only person in this category that does that. So that's interesting. And then I want to just say, a characteristic of his playing, he's an extremely melodic player, but he's also kind of a brilliant contrapuntalist. The counterpoint in his playing is just incredible. You might not notice it because he's so swinging and he's so bluesy and he's so melodic, but especially if you can hear him play solo guitar or anything with more than one note happening at a time, you can hear his brilliant counterpoint. So one definite example of that is his solo guitar album, which is just live at Smalls. Let me see if I can find it here. I think it's just called Solo. I'm actually not seeing it here, but that's brilliant, and you can hear, you can hear it all coming right at you because it's solo guitar. But then I also want to mention the two personal favorites of mine. The one that originally got me into him is Earth Tones. That's on the Criss Cross label. It's from the late 90s, 1998, and that's the original trio that I mentioned. Actually, I think that's the first record with that trio, at least under his name. So that's Larry Goldings and Bill Stewart, and that's I got a handful of originals on there, but a few standards, and that's him kind of just earlier in his career, not as many the cordial things happening, more of like a single note player, but it's a brilliant display of of jazz, linear composition and brilliant melodic playing, as well as his own compositions. Then I'm going to also recommend the Monk record, which is with Doug Weiss and Bill Stewart from 2008. It's a little bit hard to get a hold of that one right now. I don't think it's on Spotify, but if you can get a hold of it, I think you just order on Amazon. It's great. It's recorded at Smalls, I think. And I think this is some of the beginnings of his solo guitar playing, even though he's not playing much of it solo. I think maybe the Monk's Mood is solo, and then he plays a duo with himself on Reflections. But you can start to see him developing that kind of like what I call the Peter Bernstein Orchestra, which is just him being a brilliant contrapuntal player in terms of voice leading. And also, you guys know my proclivity to these guitar trio albums. This is the only record I think that he has, which is guitar, bass, and drums. So I'm a little bit biased because I like that instrumentation. And he's playing all Monk tunes, so it's definitely that's going to be one of my top picks. And then the other one, just because it's so popular and has made so many waves on the scene, I'm going to say Signs of Life, which is his second record. And it's just like an all-star cast. It's got Christian McBride, Brad Meldau, and Greg Hutchinson. It's from the Criss Cross label, 1995. And, it's kind of similar. His playing is similar to that in Earth Tones. Is a similar stage in his career, but it's just like a brilliant cast. It's an all-star cast. They actually did a reunion tribute album to their own album, which is live, I think at Dizzy, Signs Live in 2017, which I actually got to see. So that was brilliant. But yeah, that's definitely something to check out. Okay, now we're going to kind of move into a different category of player. And so I think this next person really changed kind of the trajectory of jazz guitar. kind of jazz, but especially of jazz guitar. So it's kind of like we have Kurt Rosenwinkel players and then post Kurt Rosenwinkel players. So yeah, number 2 is going to be Kurt Rosenwinkel. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Originally from Philadelphia, I think around the same age as Bernstein, but went in a very different direction. They actually came up in New York around the same time. They were playing in the first very early days of Smalls, but obviously have very different aesthetics. They actually do play together sometimes. They have kind of a 2 guitar, with rhythm sections sort of band, which is really interesting to see. Because they're so different. So Kurt really changed the game in terms of jazz guitar. I mean, initially, I would say just in terms of sound, that's huge. So instead of going for that dry, huge, big hollow body sound, he played a semi-hollow. He plays a different guitar every time. He's using a different guitar every month, it seems, these days. But he's got a semi-hollow or at least a very thin guitar, and he's using a lot of delay and reverb and who knows what other effects. But it's a very legato, wet sound, which is very different from the original, Kenny Burrell sort of brighter, drier sound. And he was not the first person to do this, but I think he was kind of one of the pivotal people the person kind of who was most influential in terms of having people follow suit in trying to copy that sound or being very influenced by that sound. So yeah, and Kurt is a really interesting character because you can't say this about too many guitar players, but he had a huge influence not just on the state of jazz guitar, but on the state of jazz in general. So he's one of the only people that you'll find are have really influenced jazz musicians, not just jazz guitar players, but people on other instruments. They're big fans of his as a composer, and then also just as a soloist, as an instrumentalist. I would say Pat Metheny would be one of the other people that definitely falls into that category, but it is pretty rare. So he really changed the game in terms of that tone. And then his playing, he kind of pivoted to what is now the modern jazz guitar sound, but he was kind of one of the first to do it, which is an extremely legato playing. So he's doing a lot of sweep picking and hammer-ons and that kind of thing. It's not as picked as somebody like George Benson or even Grant Green or Bernstein or something like that. And it's kind of a trade-off when you get into that bag. So you're playing more legato. It has less of a percussive element to it, so it's not as strong rhythmically in a way, but you can also play faster, and it has a kind of different aesthetic to it. It's kind of got this futuristic alien kind of sound, especially in more recent times. You can hear him, he's using a pedal these days where it actually I think it purposely delays the attack. So that's an interesting it's an interesting feature of his playing. So I want to recommend a couple albums of his. The first one I'm going to say is just a game changer in terms of modern jazz, just one of the best modern jazz records just to date, and that's called The Next Step, and it's got Ben Street, Jeff Ballard, and Mark Turner on it. So this is kind of I think just an iconic record of his, and it just shows how not just beautiful, how beautiful music he can make, but just in terms of virtuosity and how technically difficult it is to do the things he's doing is just kind of incredible. So it's pretty hard to play guitar trio without a piano, and it's also sometimes can be harder to play with a horn because you have to kind of still create that same energy on your own solo than the horn just did in the solo before. And I think he did a great job of navigating that. But it's not, he's playing chords, he's comping for himself. But it's a little different doing that on a blues than it is doing it on a one of your own compositions, which has crazy complex harmony that's moving at like the speed of a freight train. So it's just crazy amount of respect for somebody who can do that, and he does it in a way where you don't even really notice how complex the songs are until you look at the sheet music or until you learn them. And I would say especially you can notice that with the tune Zavago, which is the first track on there. And for those of you who don't know, he is playing a guitar in a different tuning for that track. And I'm almost positive that he's not playing a different guitar for the solo. So meaning he like wrote that song in a different tuning, and then he is soloing over that song, which has really complex harmony and has tricky rhythmically as well, but in a different tuning. So if you can't wrap your head around that, it's like basically like learning another instrument, and he did that just all to play that one song. So he's just kind of a freak of nature in a lot of different ways. But yeah, so I'm gonna say the next step, I think that's 2001 on Verve, but I could be wrong actually. And then the other album I'm gonna mention is Standards. I think it's called Reflections, and that's a little later. I can't remember the year right now, but it's like maybe around 2010 or something like that. And that's got Eric Harlan and Eric Rivas. And as I mentioned, I'm privy to trio playing, especially that instrumentation, guitar, bass, drums, and especially Standards. You can really kind of hear the essence of what somebody is about in that instrumentation. I would say just the title track alone is worth the cost of admission. So Reflections is just kind of like a brilliant display of chord soloing, regular soloing, interpreting a song, interpreting a Monk song. I mean, that intro alone is just kind of brilliant way of like riffing off of a melody, playing inside in some ways of a song, but kind of almost coming up with your own composition within that. It's pretty brilliant. So definitely I would check those two out. Okay, so now we're moving into kind of the post-Kurt Rosenwinkel players. So I think the most appropriate to mention in that vein is Mike Moreno. Definitely another personal favorite of mine. Very much so coming out of the Kurt school, and you can definitely hear that with his sound. So he's, a very classic example of somebody who's very influenced by Kurt. He's got that really wet sound, the reverb, the delay. Very influenced by Kurt, but he's got his own thing. In a way, it's like a more polished version in some sense. I mean, Kurt is a freak of nature in terms of his virtuosity and technicality, but in a way, I think Mike kind of almost does it in an even more technically sound way. But he also kind of added his own spin to that. I mean, he's very versed in the tradition too. I think he even studied with Peter or Bernstein, or at least was very influenced by him. But he's also got some different elements. He's influenced by folk music. He's cited, Joni Mitchell as an influence, and he's got kind of like this dark kind of rocker vibe with it, which I think is reflected in the music. And he's got some brilliant finger style things happening too. He plays acoustic guitar sometimes. But yeah, he's kind of he's definitely a more modern player, but he's got very strong roots in the tradition. If you ever hear him talk, he's always, like many of the time, talking about tradition and how he was influenced by older people. Kind of got his start playing with people like Joshua Redman and Nick Payton. Also want to note that I want to get to my favorite albums of his. So I would say for me, my favorite albums of his are First in Mind on the Criss Cross label, 2011, and that's got Aaron Parks, Kendrick Scott, I want to say Matt Brewer, but I'm not actually 100% sure, so I'm gonna have to double check that one. But that's a great album. I feel like that's kind of his, like the first album of his where he really sounds like himself, at least like his modern self. And I think part of that is because he was originally playing like a 335 or some sort of Gibson semi-hollow, and then he pivoted and started playing a Marchione, which I just think it's just like the most gorgeous, lush sound. And I'm pretty sure First in Mind is his first record of his as a leader that he's playing that. And so you can really hear his that aesthetic and him really coming into his own sound there. Mike, for me, that's one of the biggest appeals, is just his sound is just the most gorgeous, lush sound. So definitely going to recommend that. I think it's actually mostly not originals. I think there might be an original on there. But yeah, you can... he plays Erigen, he plays soul, dance, and Redmond tune, and yeah, definitely some cool tunes on there. And then you know me, I like these standards trio albums. So 3 for 3, which is from the Crisscross label, 2017, with Kendrick Scott and Doug Weiss. I love that record, and you can really, again, you can hear the essence of what he's all about. You can kind of boil it down and learn a lot from those kind of records. He's playing standards, but it's, from a modern perspective. So he's got a Radiohead tune in there. He's playing a Wayne Shorter tune. So it's like, not so standards, but that's a brilliant album of his. Okay, we're going to pivot to somebody else who's also, I think, a very post-Kurt player and was very influenced by Kurt, and you can definitely hear that in his sound, and that's an Israeli guitar player named Gilad Hexelman. Definitely like in the last few decades, you can see so many people who are not American or are not originally from the States. So many great players from around the world. We have, YouTube and the internet, and there's definitely a lot more international players who are making a big impression on the scene. Gilad, he's lived in New York for, 20 something years. So Gilad kind of took that Kurt sound, the delay and the reverb, the big washy kind of hall, sound, but he kind of did something different with it. He also has a very bright sound, which is not very characteristic of that. So like the Kurt aesthetic is kind of usually a more dark sound, and then but Gilad took that and he kind of has a brighter, more trebly sound, but at the same time he's also took that legato and kind of put it on steroids. So he's like hammering on, pulling off even more, if you can imagine. And he's got crazy chops. But then you kind of have that fused with this kind of new rhythmic concept, which is, coming from, at least to my knowledge, Ari Honig and people like that. A lot of Israeli musicians, I don't know what is going on in the water over there or something, but they have a crazy sense of rhythm, especially in terms of like polyrhythms. Gilad is definitely a shining example of that, and he did get his start. He's a frequent collaborator of his, or at least was, Ari Honig. So, and Ari, if you don't know Ari Honig, he's like a crazy rhythmic genius, and Gilad can definitely hold his own with Ari. So you kind of have this juxtaposition of the kind of washy, reverberated Kurt sound, but it's also very bright, and then he's playing all these like crazy rhythmic polyrhythm things. But then you kind of have another element, which is he's also kind of got a little bit of a folksy edge to him, but it's folksy in a different way. Not we have these boomers, the Frizzels and the Matheny's, who are kind of putting that like old school Americana thing, but then Gilad kind of fuses it with a more kind of new agey pop indie sensibility. He's a really interesting player, definitely somebody I love to listen to. And yeah, in terms of his records, I'm going to recommend Split Life, which is, I think, his first record. And that's got Ari Honig on it. And then, yeah, he's playing a mix of like standards and originals. And then the other one that I really like, which actually was the one that got me into his playing, is called Holmes from 2015, and that's got Marcus Gilmore and Joe Martin on it. I think it's all originals, and maybe not all, but it's at least mostly originals, and it's like a brilliant display of the things that I was just talking about. It's got a very like folksy melodic bend to it, but yeah, that's a great example of his playing. Okay. Now we're going to pivot to another post-Kurt player, but he's a little bit different in the sense that he's not using that kind of like washy reverberated, delayed sound. Yeah, so Laga is an interesting character in a few ways. He was actually the first of... In a few different ways. He's the first guitar player to win the Thelonious Monk competition, and the first jazz guitar player at Juilliard. So that's an interesting fact. But yeah, as I mentioned, he kind of has like a drier, more classic jazz guitar sound. It sounds to me like he's not using pedals, but I actually have seen him live and it looks like he's using pedals, but if he is, he's not using a lot of reverb or delay, so it sounds actually almost more Metheny-esque in that it is a kind of a darker sound. It's not quite as bright as like Grant Green or Kenny Burrell, but it's not like a washy kind of sound reminiscent of that Kurt style, and he's really not playing legato, or at least not in the same way that like Kurt and Mike are. He is picking a lot. There's a lot of picking, I think a lot of alternate picking, maybe some sweeping, but it's definitely not as legato. He's kind of got this weird thing where he doesn't really bar anything. So, because I think he says it doesn't sound as clean. So he plays every note with a different finger, which sounds maybe not that crazy, but try it. It's pretty crazy. And I mean, I think as a result, its playing is really clean and really efficient. But yeah, that's kind of just like a freak of nature thing to me. But yeah, definitely somebody who has a good concept of the tradition, but I would say is more of a contemporary player. Most of his albums as a leader, and also people he plays with, are a lot more contemporary. I think he did study with Peter Bernstein originally, so he definitely has some of that in there. But yeah, so he's definitely somebody interesting to check out in terms of like voicings and contrapuntal voice leading concept. Somebody who sounds to me very conscious of that. So I'm going to recommend 2 albums by him. The one that he's playing more originals on it's called Foolhardy from the Criss Cross label in 2013, and it's an all-star cast. It's got Aaron Parks, Ben Street, Bill Stewart, and yeah, he's got like some of his compositions are absolutely beautiful, and they're complex too. It's not just like 4/4 swinging. There's a lot of intricacy going on there, and then the other one that I'm gonna recommend is called Small Club Big City, and that's recorded at the La Lanterna. Sorry, what's it called? The bar next door. Yeah, bar next door. With Orlando Fleming, Marcus Gilmore, and Jamire Williams. They're trading off, I guess. And that's more of a standards trio album, which as I mentioned before, that's a great way to check out what somebody's kind of all about. And, they're playing standards, but they're really going pretty far out. And it's actually kind of an exercise just to like listen and try and keep the form, try and keep the beat, because they're really expanding and taking it to a different place. So it's kind of an interesting thing to check out. Okay, number 6 this is the last one. We're kind of there's kind of a pattern going on here. So we started with Peter, and that's like a more traditional jazz guitar sound. And then we did the post Kurt Rosenwinkel players, and some of the people who were extremely influenced by Kurt. And now I think this last person, he is more contemporary. He's only a couple years older than me, and you really kind of don't hear that Kurt influence, at least I don't, in his playing anymore. So maybe that's indicative of another generation, or maybe he's just kind of his own player and really unique in that way. But we're talking about Julian Lage. So yeah, he is definitely younger than the other guys that I mentioned, but he's definitely made such a huge impact on jazz guitar and on this music that you can't leave him out of this list. So Julian is a super interesting player. In that he is a modern contemporary jazz guitar player playing, a lot of interesting, innovative music, but it doesn't really have that Kurt aesthetic. So he's not really playing with like reverb and delay and that like wet sound. He's almost, it's almost like the opposite. He's got an extremely dry sound. He plays with like a gritty overdrive many of the time. And it's kind of like this weird dynamic where he's almost like drawing from very old sounds but like making it new. So you can kind of hear like a Django influence and like an Americana influence, maybe even some Charlie Christian, but like it's kind of reinterpreted in a totally modern, unique way. But yeah, Julian is kind of also one of these jack of many trades. He has a few different aesthetics that he weaves through, and so he has his kind of like modern jazz aesthetic where he came up playing with people like Eric Harlan, so he can really hang and hold his own in that context. But he's definitely strayed away a lot from that in more recent years. And Taylor Eichste was also somebody he played with, I think grew up with too, maybe. So he kind of, started out in that modern jazz aesthetic, and then he's kind of gone a lot of different ways since then. So he kind of has his like folksy jazz kind of alternative group trio that he's been playing with for the last like 5 or 10 years. And that's with, Kenny Wollesen / Dave King and Jorge Roeder / Scott Colley. And they've released a bunch of trio albums, which I think are absolutely spectacular. And so that's kind of a fusion of like folk, Americana, pop with jazz. And he plays this like very folksy sounding, bright, twangy, overdriven Telecaster, which it's almost kind of like I would say of the school of Bill Frisell, but in the sense where it's like coming from that folk aesthetic. But he definitely taking it in a different place, and he picks a little bit harder, and he's got way more chops, and it's kind of like got a rock thing. So yeah, that's his like trio kind of folksy thing, and then jazz folk thing, and then he's got where he really leans into the folk, and he plays acoustic guitar, and so his second album, as well as the solo guitar album that he has, is really reminiscent of that aesthetic. And then he also has kind of an avant-garde thing he does. He's done a lot of collaborations with Nels Cline, and he gets into kind of like more noise, experimental pedal stuff going on, more atonal. So yeah, I guess those are kind of the few different things. He also can kind of get into this traditional kind of swing jazz thing, which is kind of more rare to see him do. But if he can kind of get into this Django sort of like 20s, 30s sound, 40s sound, which is really kind of incredible for someone who does all those other things. But yeah, as a leader, in terms of like his iconic records, I'm going to say My favorites and recommendations are Modern Lore. So that's of that trio aesthetic that I mentioned earlier. There's a handful of records where it's that instrumentation and that concept, but I'm going to say Modern Lore is my favorite. And it's a lot of, or actually it's all originals, and that's from 2018. And it's got Scott Colley on bass, Kenny Wollesen on drums and vibes, and it's got Jesse Harris, who's a favorite of mine, also on a couple other tracks, and Tyler Chester on keyboards. But it's mostly, like, at least aesthetically, a trio album. And then the other one I'm going to mention is his solo album called World's Fair. So I was mentioning his, like, kind of a folk aesthetic where he's really leaning into that, like, bluegrass thing. And one of the examples is of that is Gladwell, is his second album. But then this one, World's Fair, it's solo guitar and it's all his tunes, or mostly his tunes. It's kind of just absolutely brilliant. Like, he's got these compositions that are, like, reminiscent of, you know, some sort of, like, bluegrass, folksy Americana style, but they're also very contemporary and, like, harmonically sophisticated and technically sophisticated as well. And it's very through composed, or at least it sounds like it to me. And yeah, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Yeah, so I think that's it. I'm probably gonna, you know, walk away and just remember that I forgot something super crucial, but I hope that's not the case. Anyways, there are our 6 top contemporary guitar players. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this whole series. I think that's going to be it for this series of top such and such number of guitar players. But yeah, let me know if you think I left anyone out, or you think I got something wrong. But also let me know if you have any suggestions in terms of this kind of oral lesson. Otherwise, I think we may be returning to the standard traditional guitar in hand model next week. But yeah, thanks guys for tuning in to another Teaching Tuesday. You can find all of these in PDF format on the Patreon. It's linked below wherever you're watching. Otherwise, yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next Tuesday.